Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Thank you and welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, where Donald Trump is addressing Republican senators right now. We're going to have an update in just a moment from Kailey, Leinz, who is following Donald Trump today on his return to the Capitol for the first time since the January 6th riots. In Italy, meantime, Joe Biden preparing to hold a bilateral news conference later on this hour with Volodymyr Zelenskiy. These two events, as Donald Trump prepares to speak as well, could collide later on this hour, drawing the literal split screen for us here today on the campaign trail. We want to start in Italy right now at the G7 with Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, who has been traveling with the president, and it's great to have you with us, Annmarie. Important news today on a development that will bring more funding, some $50 billion in help for Ukraine through a new loan syndicate. How's this all going to work?
Yeah, that's right, Joe. The United States has been pushing to try to get this done for months, and finally they were able to get it over the finish line at this G7 leaders summit. They're basically front-loading these interest payments that have been accruing and will in the future accrue for these Russian frozen assets, $280 billion worth that are sitting in Europe. Now, the Europeans were game to basically send what was collecting interest this year, say $3 to $6 billion. But the United States didn't think that was enough. So what they're doing is they're taking the future payments up front and sending this loan to Ukraine. Now, some technical details still need to be worked out after the G7, but this is certainly a political win for the administration and also for Ukraine. When I last spoke to the Ukrainian foreign minister in Davos, he said 2024, the main goal is the financial help Ukraine needs and tapping the value of those Russian assets. He said the political will needs to be there. And once the politicians make a decision, then the lawyers and the bankers can get to work. So when President Biden steps up today, Volodymyr Zelenskiy, he's going to want to tout this deal as well as the bilateral security agreement that the two leaders will sign.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. We'll be hearing from the president, if all things stay on time, from both presidents in about 45 minutes. Annmarie, you're going to have domestic reporters there from the U.S., from the White House press corps, who want to ask about a Supreme Court ruling today on mifepristone, who want to ask Joe Biden about a potential ceasefire in Israel. The message from the White House today, though, the administration is squarely about Ukraine. What will be Joe Biden's message on some of these other issues from overseas?
Well, he's certainly going to want to talk about Ukraine because he's going to be standing next to Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelenskiy. And the United States has been talking about the fact that they think the G7 is now more unified than ever in modern times. It's interesting you would say that, given the fact that most of these leaders, besides Giorgia Meloni, are coming here with immense amount of political pressure at home. Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, just to name a few. When it comes to the mifepristone ruling on the Supreme Court, we did get a statement from the president talking about the fact, really pivoting the fact that they're so happy that the Supreme Court upheld women's access to mifepristone. But Joe, they squarely are pointing this to November, saying that more needs to be done to protect women's health care. And we're going to hear probably the same message from the president again this evening. I'm sure he's going to be asked that question when he's faced with a number of domestic reporters in the room.
That's got to be true. Annmarie Hordern among them. Great to see you, Annmarie. Thank you for joining us from Bari, Italy, as she follows the president at this important summit. Bloomberg's Kailey, Leinz, meantime, is making her way around the Capitol here following Donald Trump at a series of events that included a speech to the Business Roundtable a short time ago, 90 CEOs in the rooms with some pretty bold names, Jamie Dimon, Tim Cook among them. Kailey, what was the message from the former president?
Well, one CEO leaving this meeting, Joe, as they're all getting just shuffled into their SUVs and not really feeling open to speaking with press, just described this meeting as informative. He said it was about 45 minutes of Donald Trump addressing those in the room. But of course, we do know that there were some heavy hitters there, including the CEOs of a number of the largest banks in the country, technology executives as well. And the message is likely to be pretty similar to what Donald Trump was preaching in his meeting with House Republicans earlier today, when he was talking about what he wants to do to help with inflation and unleash the the U.S. economy. In large part, that seems to be deregulating it in terms of industries like energy, and then also maybe higher tariffs on adversaries in particular, and potentially using the proceeds from those higher tariffs to lower income taxes for Americans. I spoke with Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia about what exactly Trump said about tariffs and taxes and how they could interplay together, and this is what she told me.
President Trump said he's floating an idea, and I think it's a wonderful idea. You know, our tax code is expiring this year, and depending on which party controls the House of Representatives will determine Americans and how much they pay in taxes. President Trump said, this is an idea, but I'd love to raise tariffs, and then he said maybe even no income taxes for Americans. Everyone was clapping in the room. I think that's a fantastic idea, and he even later joked and he said, if you guys are going to go vote on something today, vote to lower taxes on Americans.
Now, that was the take from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. I did speak as well with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, who seemed to have a bit of a different take on how exactly Trump presented that idea in the room. She said that he didn't think he was, he said he wasn't presenting that as serious policy that he was outlining, but he did speak about the prospect of higher tariffs on adversaries and potentially that being used as a pay for lower taxes. It's just not clear that he actually said that it would mean no income tax at all, Joe.
Well, this is really interesting, Kailey. We sat here yesterday, you and I, with Kevin Brady, the former chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, now former congressman, who is leaning into this with the group that he's working for now to try to start the argument now about making the Trump tax cuts permanent. They're not waiting to find out who wins this election. What did the folks in the room have to say, if anything, about that? Because they also heard from Jeff Zients, the White House chief of staff, today, speaking on behalf of Joe Biden.
Yeah, interesting, of course, that Joe Biden is preoccupied in Italy, where Annmarie Hordern was joining from just moments ago. Therefore, his chief of staff had to speak on his behalf. But it is, in some sense, a bit of conflicting messaging, because obviously the corporate tax cuts that were put into place under Donald Trump in 2017 aren't necessarily supported at large by Democrats, who think those lower taxes just resulted in higher profits being kept by those companies, whereas Donald Trump is really pitching easier regulation, lower taxes across the board. That seems to be the idea. On the idea of 2017 tax cuts, though, and potentially those being reinstated, when I was speaking with Congresswoman Malliotakis earlier, she said he didn't really talk about that specifically, more so just building upon the success he had in terms of lowering taxes in his first administration. It seems as though this is a conversation that has gotten started, but likely still needs to have a lot of details hammered out. It seemed by and large the meetings that Trump had this morning, at least with the House, were much more overarching than they were getting into the very specific nitty-gritty of policy. And of course, getting any of this policy actually implemented, Joe, will likely require Republicans keeping a hold of the House of Representatives, which a lot of people were talking a big game about leaving the meeting this morning, but we know is far from guaranteed.
That's the sticky part, isn't it? Kailey, great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us in your travels around the District of Columbia today, from the Wharf, then back to Capitol Hill, where Donald Trump is next addressing Republican senators. And we'll have more from the former president later this hour. He's at the NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee, and will hold a news conference, or at least deliver remarks, to be more exact, from there. About 20 minutes from now is the schedule. We'll see how on time things stay, along with Joe Biden as well. 15 minutes later, set to hold forth in his news conference from the G7. The idea of extending or making permanent, though, the Trump tax cuts from 2017 is something that's already being debated, as we've made clear here. And Maya MacGuineas has some thoughts about this. The president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the group has been crunching numbers on this to understand better what the impact would be. Kailey's talking about offsets. Let's talk to Maya about this. It's great to see you, as always, Maya, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Let's say they get this done. Donald Trump wins the presidency and he manages to get this through Congress. Making permanent the 2017 tax cuts would do what to our deficit?
Yeah, so it would absolutely explode an already untenable fiscal situation. So just to take stock of where we are already on track to borrow another $20 trillion over the next decade. We are going to be hitting record levels of debt as a share of the economy in just a few years. Interest payments are growing faster than anything in the budget. They are the single largest item in the budget. The fiscal situation is really bad. Part of what got there, obviously some of what got there was emergencies like COVID, where we should have borrowed. But a big component was that a lot of policies have not been offset in recent years. One of those big ones was the Trump tax cuts. They added $2 trillion to the debt. Many members of Congress were saying, we made a mistake. We should have, and these are the Republicans who supported that, we should have also cut spending. We didn't do that in order to keep this from adding to the debt. But now, if you are talking about really extending these tax cuts, again, the portions that are expiring, we are talking about even larger a price tag, upwards of $4 trillion. And then there are other things they are talking about, including some of the business tax cuts that have expired, could bring you up to $5 trillion. There is absolutely no space in our very dangerous fiscal situation right now to be talking about adding trillions more. And so you just can't talk about this without thinking about how you're going to offset those costs and that lost revenue.
Well, this is really interesting. And this is something that people need to hear, because the argument, Maya, is the tax cuts aren't the problem. The spending is. And we simply need to rein in spending or somehow refigure entitlements like Social Security and Medicare to get through this. But you and I both know that's not about to happen. And neither of the men who are on the verge of becoming president, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, say they're going to touch the entitlements.
I mean, that's right. I have no problem with the argument. One can be for big government or small government, and they can be fiscally responsible or fiscally reckless, either way. But it is absolutely correct to say that our spending is growing at a massive clip. We're going to have huge amounts of growth in healthcare, retirement, and interest over the coming decades. Defense spending is also likely to increase because there are many more threats around the world. The problem is the people making those arguments then turn around and vote for spending increases. And if you look at what happened under President Trump's tenure, he cut taxes, but he raised spending massively. Every time they increased the debt ceiling, whereas most recently the debt ceiling had a package that helped to reduce borrowing, every time under President Trump, they actually added more spending to the overall budget and more borrowing. So you can't talk about the importance of cutting spending while you're casting votes to increase spending, just like most of the people who've taken a no new tax pledge also at the same time have voted to increase spending. About 90% of them have. So the hypocrisy in budget run large, run on all sides, but it's really what's gotten us into this mess of huge, huge mountains of debt and more to come if we don't make changes.
Well, how important is this to the people who are in the room at the Business Roundtable today, Maya? You interact with a lot of them. You know, you don't hear a lot about deficits and debt in a campaign cycle when everybody's trying to grab the brass ring here. And you know there's going to be a big drive to increase Pentagon spending if there's another Trump presidency. And that'll probably happen under a Biden second term if there is one here. So what do the executives in that room think about this? Are they as worried as you are?
So my experience with the business leaders is they are very worried about the national debt, but they probably, many of them will put having tax cuts over the concerns about the debt. So we've seen that, in the past, CEOs were some of the best advocates for getting our fiscal situation under control, but I think they actually got frustrated because Washington was unable to implement those changes. And so they've turned their attention more towards the tax regime, the regulatory regime. I think they would support, and I'm generalizing, they all have different points of view. Many of them would support those spending cuts that go along with tax cuts. But again, as we've just said, there seems to be no political appetite for that. And the problem is we now have two people running for president competing on giveaways. Who can give more in tax cuts and to which group, and who can increase spending more, and who can protect Social Security and Medicare, which, by the way, are heading towards insolvency. Protecting them means across the board cuts in those programs for recipients and providers. That is a terrible promise to today's seniors and people who will depend on the programs. And yet that's what our politicians are promising. There's very little talk of fiscal responsibility. And I'm sure any CEO who somebody asked, do you think the debt should be lower than it is? They would say yes, because there's no way you can look at this trajectory and think that things are okay. We are in grave, grave danger of weakening our economy and our national security if we don't find a way to bring our borrowing trajectory down.
We're speaking some hard truths here with Maya MacGuineas from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Spent the day yesterday, Maya, talking about inflation, and everyone cheered this CPI showing prices going up at a slower rate than some expected, still rising. However, depending on the metric you look at here, the Federal Reserve is higher for longer. What is the impact of ballooning deficits on this very thing, the issue that's driving voters in November, the issue of inflation?
That's right. So inflation is having a huge impact on how people feel about the economy. Clearly, we got to this inflationary moment for a number of factors, supply chains, oil, and one of those factors was excessive fiscal stimulus. At the end of COVID, we put more money in the economy than we should have, and that kicked off inflation. It's turned out that it's been difficult to get control of. The problem that politicians, all of whom want to help alleviate inflation, that they don't recognize is that all the borrowing they're engaging in now makes inflation worse, not better. If you want to help inflation, you need to bring your borrowing down so you are not overstimulating the economy. And you don't hear a lot of talk connecting those two, because again, right now, this is a political moment of promises of things to give away. We are so far removed from talking about hard truths in the budget. We don't even pass budgets. So we don't even think about what these trade-offs are. But it's really politically dangerous. There's so much pandering and demagoguing, and no one out there saying, here's what we've got to do. We've got to reduce our spending. We've got to raise our revenues. We have to reform our entitlements. Those are all critical if we are going to get out from under this mountain of debt.
Well, that's why we speak the hard truths here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Maybe they should have had Maya in the room today. How would that go at the Business Roundtable? Maya MacGuineas, always a pleasure. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. It's Little Friday. It's 100 degrees or something in Washington this afternoon. It's a good day to take Metro, says Mike Dorning, because the street closures will be enough to point you in that direction. Donald Trump shuttling around Capitol Hill. He's down in the wharf area right now as we connected with Kailey Leinz from the Business Roundtable. That's where the former president is as we speak, talking to a room full of about 90 CEOs and some pretty bold-faced names. Jamie Dimon, Tim Cook, both in the room. We'll see if Kailey can have a conversation with any of them on the way out here. So far, the former president has been not really seen in public, but meeting with lawmakers, meeting with leaders on Capitol Hill, and now corporate leaders. And we should know the Business Roundtable event is not a Trump event. This is a normal part of the campaign cycle in which representatives from both campaigns speak to the CEOs. Joe Biden's in Italy for the G7, and so he sent his chief of staff to speak on his behalf. That took place earlier than Donald Trump speaking right now to the Business Roundtable. Mike Dorning's got his eyes on all this. He's not on Metro. He's actually here in the studio in the safe confines of the Bloomberg Bureau. It's good to see you.
Great to be here.
This is kind of a moment after January 6th, the big return. This isn't really about policy, though, right? This is, I'm back.
It's about unity. It's about getting all the Republicans behind him.
What does it tell you that Mitch McConnell shows up for this?
Well, Mitch McConnell, since the beginning of the year, even though he's had big differences with Donald Trump, particularly over the January 6th attack, wants a Republican victory in November. He wants to push through Republican policies. And in particular, he wants Trump to be behind the Senate candidates and the congressional candidates as well. And so here you have the whole party unifying. And that's really important for the congressional candidates too, even the ones in swing districts, because they need enthusiasm from the base.
I'm guessing they're not talking about their wives. Is Mitch McConnell holding his nose here? Or?
I think he's Mitch McConnell is like Mr. Pragmatist.
Right?
He's always been a political pragmatist, and he, understands politics, understands the calculation, understands there's no benefit for his goal of having a Republican take over the Senate, to have differences between the Senate and the Republican nominee.
Interesting moment for the Republican conference. They held the Attorney General in contempt of Congress with a vote that they could show the former president today. They gave him the game ball from the Republican-won Congressional baseball game last night. Quite the stage setter before we even got the SCOTUS ruling today for Donald Trump to be back. This Merrick Garland vote, they didn't know if it was actually going to pass. It did.
They whipped it very hard.
They whipped it pretty hard. Does it matter?
It probably doesn't matter that much for the general public, and certainly this is going nowhere. But it is an effort to kind of muddy the water on Trump's criminal conviction.
Because they didn't provide the audio recordings of Joe Biden's interview with
that's
special counsel.
That's the actual
Did this set a precedent, though, as some Democrats say, a dangerous precedent?
Democrats also tried to hold the Trump's Attorney General in contempt of Congress, and that Justice Department declined to prosecute it. You might well imagine this Justice Department not prosecuting this. I mean, arguably, had they gone along with this, and it could have created a precedent. But really, what this is just using every tool at the House's disposal to try to put some cover fire for Trump on his criminal cases.
Got it. Mike Dorning, great to see you, as always. Funny day in Washington. Maybe I'll bump into you on the Metro. Always a pleasure to have Mike Dorning with us, helping to report and edit our political coverage here in Washington every day. I'm Joe Mathieu in the nation's capital, where we're keeping an eye on a couple of different things. As we mentioned, the split screen today. Donald Trump will emerge from this meeting at some point here with the CEO. He's going to hold a news conference. That's scheduled for an hour from now. 15 minutes later, the President of the United States is expected to be holding forth from Italy at the G7 in a bilateral news conference that he's going to hold with Volodymyr Zelenskiy. And they have something to announce today with a new agreement that we're going to spend some time talking to Courtney and McBride about here, because this is the moment, these are the moments that the incumbent enjoys, right? And he's got some real work to do, of course, with the potential for a ceasefire in Israel to come from this, not to mention progress in Ukraine. Courtney McBride is Bloomberg's national security reporter, frequently on the plane at events like these, and we're lucky to have her today in Washington, D.C. You're watching this from across the ocean. Just like everyone in Washington here with Donald Trump, the split screen is really incredible. So give us your sense of what Joe Biden wants to accomplish in this news conference today, because he's going to be hearing from domestic and foreign reporters.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
The big thing today certainly is Ukraine. We have a report out that the G7 leaders have agreed on a plan. It's still somewhat vague, but for a loan syndicate that is going to allow them to tap Russian reserves, frozen currency to repay loans issued by the U.S., the EU, and other G7 countries to support Ukraine's defense against Russia. So I think that's, Zelensky, as you said, is in Italy. He's meeting with President Biden, and those are the types of things that I think they're going to want to emphasize today, that the West is staying firm in support of Ukraine.
The seizing of Russian assets is something we're hearing a lot about, knowing that they passed the Repo Act on Capitol Hill months ago, I guess at this point, weeks at least ago, when the Ukrainian funding was passed. President signed that into law. But clearly it's not as simple as that, with the bulk of this money locked up in Europe. And I'm hearing that legal challenges would make this a years-long project. Is that the reality?
So, I mean, I think the workaround that they seem to have landed upon after months of wrangling is to use the profits, the interest essentially on those assets, as a loan guarantee for the countries. So the individual countries are going to issue loans to Ukraine and assume the risk that those Russian assets, roughly $280 billion, most of which, as you said, are held outside the U.S., held in Europe, to back those loans.
What do you make of the guest list at this G7? Obviously, Vladimir Putin's not walking around I don't think China's invited, right? Maybe you can explain that to me. But you've got Volodymyr Zelenskiy of Ukraine. You've got the Pope. Is this a new look for the G7?
Well, I mean, the G7 host is always welcome to add additional guests. President Zelensky has certainly been making the rounds and making his case around the world wherever he can. We saw him in Davos. We've seen him at the United Nations. Possibly he could come to the NATO summit. So all of those venues make sense for him as he continues to plead his case and appeal to the West to remain with Ukraine and supportive of it.
If Courtney McBride is at this G7, where's your focus? Is it the sideline meetings that are taking place when the press corps might not be around? Is it the contents of the communique? Folks who are with us right now on YouTube are looking literally at the photo opportunity. There are a lot of different elements of a G7 that make this important. Where's the news for you?
Certainly. I mean, I think those bilateral meetings can be really critical ways for the leaders to try to iron out areas of difference among the partners. One may try to lean on another and just make sure that joint communique does reflect a real unanimity. Because
sometimes 6 months later, you hear about something that developed in a meeting like that. Guess who? They were in the same room. You might not have even known about it. Is spontaneity part of this for the administration to try to let nature take its course on some of these issues?
Certainly possible. Obviously, for the host, you probably want a very tightly choreographed event. But they have to seize opportunities where they can to build consensus, perhaps to secure agreement on things that might have been at issue. I mean, as we discussed, this frozen assets plan has been in the works for months and months, and some countries may have been a little bit more gung ho than others. But the legal precedent that it could establish is a real concern for folks both in the U.S. government and in partner governments.
When will we have takeaways? By the end of the day tomorrow, you'll have a sense of whether this was productive, successful for Joe Biden?
I think by then we will have a sense of that. But for something like this plan, the proof will be in the pudding. It could take months to iron out the details, but the goal is for Ukraine to have some of these funds in hand by the end of the year. The goal is $50 billion in aggregate in loans from the U.S. and other partner countries.
Great. We bring you to the source on this program, and the source today is Courtney McBride. Love having you on. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
As always, Bloomberg's national security reporter bringing us inside our coverage here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
As Donald Trump and the chief of staff at the White House separately brief the Business Roundtable. There's quite a collection of 90 CEOs here. Think Tim Scott, Jamie Dimon in the same room, listening to policy proposals as they try to get their heads around them, maybe even have an opportunity to affect those policy proposals and the agendas from the two front runners here, the incumbent and the Republican presumed nominee. We assemble our panel with more to talk about here, and we've got some polling to throw in as we're going to be hearing from both Donald Trump and Joe Biden about an hour from now. Trump in Washington, where he's back. Joe Biden in Italy at the G7. And it looks like we're going to have competing news conferences here. I don't know if they're watching each other or how this is going to work out. The choreography could be interesting. Maybe one waits for the other. Maybe one tries to interrupt the other. They're going to force likely a split screen right here and on visual media across the world today. The world is literally watching. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and I wonder what's going through your mind here, Rick, having run a presidential campaign and worked for several others, how you would handle this, knowing the incumbent is holding forth right around the same time in a news conference with Volodymyr Zelenskiy, of all people. How would you work this when it comes to optics, choreography, and the way you want it to play on the news later?
Yeah, being in Washington is a two-edged sword for Donald Trump. He is the insurgent. He, talks about being against Washington, and now he's going to be seen all around the world, as you described, but more importantly in the 6 or 7 targeted states for this general election, hanging around a bunch of politicians all day. And whether they're the House Republicans or the Senate Republicans, these are the most unpopular politicians in America. Congressional approvals are now down to about 13%. That's probably family members and staffers make up that group. And so it's not the greatest look. That being said, he kind of has an obligation to show up and take control of the party that he is now the standard bearer of. Being the nominee of the party puts him in charge of the politics of the party. And that's really what this represents more than anything else, is the landing of his nomination, and the formality of meeting with leaders of the party. And yet I would say if he had a choice, he'd probably rather be at a G7 meeting looking presidential and not getting embroiled in, every little skirmish that's happening on Capitol Hill.
So it's as simple as that. And Rick Davis reminding us, if you're with us on YouTube, that it is Seersucker Thursday in the nation's capital. As always, bringing some class to the joint. Rick, I'll tell you, I want to count on how many seersuckers were in that meeting with Donald Trump at the Capitol Hill Club earlier. As we add the voice of Brad Howard, he's back with us, Democratic strategist and founder of the Corcoran Street Group. Brad, what's your thought? It sounds like advantage Joe Biden if we go into split screen mode next hour with Donald Trump in town here with the Republican leadership, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Joe Biden with Volodymyr Zelenskiy in Italy.
Yeah, I think it's a reminder of the foreign policy credentials that President Biden brought to the campaign initially, as 8 years as vice president and numerous years in the Senate as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I thought he did a tremendous job in France around the anniversary of D-Day. And keep in mind, you split screen that with Donald Trump's presidency when he wouldn't go give a speech because it was raining and he didn't want to get wet. You had Joe Biden out there honoring the greatest generation, probably the last time those folks will be there to gather with that many folks alive who were there in D-Day. And so, that combined with him showcasing the American presidency on the world stage is always a good optic to have. And, just a reminder of the chaos that is the House Republican majority, the party of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, and that's where Donald Trump is today. So, yes, I agree. I think it's a solid day for President Biden. I think it's been a solid week for President Biden. You've seen the economic numbers go down, start to improve, inflation coming down, all in all, and Biden's poll numbers started slowly going up, not to mention 34 convictions for Donald Trump, felony convictions. So, all things being equal, I would certainly be President Biden right now rather than Donald Trump.
With all of that said, Mike Allen squashes together some polling in a note from Axios this morning with the state of play showing a significant shift toward Donald Trump from the country's youngest voters. Look at New York Times Siena polling of likely voters. Biden has a 2-point lead over Trump. Recent Quinnipiac survey, Trump ahead by a point among registered voters between 18 and 34. CNN exit polling showed Joe Biden did win the 18 to 29-year-old vote by quite a bit in 2020, 24 percentage points. Hillary Clinton won it by 19 points in 2016. Young people are said to be a huge problem for Joe Biden, Rick Davis, but you always remind us that it's pretty tough to get young people out to begin with.
Yeah, on top of all those numbers, the underlying number is, almost 40% of the 18 to 29-year-olds in that 2020 contest that Biden did so well in chose not to vote. And you have even more this time telling pollsters that they're less likely to vote. It's really kind of a part of an overall realignment that's going on in America. The driver behind these 18 to 29-year-olds is still education. If you don't have a college education, you're much more likely to be a Trump supporter regardless of your age. That includes young people 18 to 29. The big economic numbers between Trump and Biden, who can best manage the economy, is the second most important driver. Young people think that the economy was better under Trump than it's been under Biden. The Biden White House has not sold the youth of America that he can provide an economy that they can flourish in. And I must admit, I think Trump's doing quite a few backflips, but he's in policy, but he's putting together some agenda items for young people that he's never done before. If anything, he's been on the other side of the equation. So it's game on for the youth vote. There are more people, 18 to 29-year-olds, saying that they'll vote for a Republican president since Ronald Reagan. This is a big switch, and it follows some of the other realignment that's going on with white working class voters.
So, Brad, what's the view from Corcoran Street Group on this? Does Joe Biden need young people, 18 to 34, to win this election?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think keep in mind that young voters don't, unlike a lot of Donald Trump's other supporters, young voters typically don't vote with a kind of a cult-like personality. Young voters are driven to the polls by issues. It takes a while for a young voter to become a loyal follower of an individual, unless you have the charisma of a Barack Obama or, or of a Ronald Reagan. And neither of these candidates have that kind of charisma. Neither of these candidates are connecting on an emotional, kind of inspirational level that draws young people to the polls. And so with that being held, with that being true, what is driving voters to the poll are issues. And issue after issue after issue, it is President Biden that's on the right side of the issue for young people. When you look at choice, when you look at climate change, when you look at gun safety, these are the issues that are driving young people to the polls. Yes, he's got some work to do with the economy, but we're starting to see those numbers to improve. But everything from student loan debt to to what's going to be impacting this generation 20, 30 years from now, Joe Biden is on the right side of these issues. And I think at the end of the day, when folks are going to see, I think the biggest hurdle right now for Joe Biden among young voters is the Israel issue. And I think that's why you see Anthony Blinken working so hard, traveling around, bouncing around the globe at the moment to try to pass the USA's ceasefire deal. If he can get that done before the Democratic convention, that will reduce a lot of headaches for Democrats heading into November.
Well, we got some ripples in the water here today from the Supreme Court, and I'd love to ask you both about how this factors in to the campaign as the court preserves full access to mifepristone. This broke just a few hours ago here, and I think the conventional wisdom is, okay, pretty good for Donald Trump today because he doesn't now have to answer to this being struck down. Does it remove a cudgel of some sort for Joe Biden? Rick, how are you seeing this ruling?
I don't know. I mean, if you just look at it politically, Biden would have been better off if the Supreme Court had done today what they did during Dobbs and take away women's access to reproductive care. That obviously helped galvanize Democratic voters that, frankly, aren't galvanized today around Joe Biden in 2022, and really help fuel success in an off-year election. That being said, I mean, certainly a success for Democrats today. They had a unanimous vote at the Supreme Court to allow this, and yet I think that sort of diminishes the issue as a turnout issue for Democrats. So it's a plus on the issue and a negative on the politics, from the way I look at it.
Yeah, this could have been a huge motivator, another motivator, Brad, for progressive Democrats. What does today's ruling mean?
Let me back up a little bit, and my Republican friend Rick here using the past tense in regards to Democratic motivations around abortion. I think if you talk to any woman in this country, the idea that they would just simply forget about this issue in a year is a little insulting. Women are fired up on this issue. Women understand what's at stake in this election, and the motivation has remained among women voters about who is going to protect their rights, their access to reproductive health, their access to make their own decisions about their own body free from government intervention. And that's Joe Biden and the Democrats. The Republicans are all over the place on this issue. And in fact, according to Donald Trump's own stance on the federal issue, supports states that want to go super restrictive, as did Arizona. Now, Arizona has since changed the law, but if the state wants to go extremely restrictive on abortion, revert to pre-Civil War standards, by all means, President Trump supports that. So I think that's the issue that's going to keep galvanizing Democrats. Yes, I mean, yes, a little boost to that would have been nice, but at what cost? I mean, I think women in this country would hate the fact that we would be talking about how great politically this would have been, if not to restrict more of their rights. And so I think this issue is a bad one for Republicans. I think anytime we're talking about it, it's bad for Donald Trump. and the Republicans, just simply because of the dogs that caught the car. They don't know what to do with this issue, and they really can't. Their base fundamentally, morally believes it is murder in any circumstance. And how can you craft compromise policy if that's your position? And so I don't blame them for the troubles they have. It's just that's the position of their base. In order to win elections, you have to compromise and appeal to a broad base, and that's a very difficult issue to compromise on. So I don't think they're going to fix this anytime soon.
Yeah, we're certainly not done hearing about it as we spend time with our panel, Rick Davis and Brad Howard. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.